It wasn't the silence that hurt most. It was what filled it. "I'm sorry, Emma," the principal said, her words trimmed with cold professionalism. "Your speech isn't appropriate for this assembly." And with that, a seventh-grade girl's plea to honor her fallen father on Veterans Day was dismissed like a whisper in the wind. No one in the room stood up. No one said, "Let her speak." They all turned away. Teachers, administrators, the ones who always preach the importance of bravery, respect, sacrifice. That day they looked down at their shoes, busy with nothing. But the silence wouldn't last, because 6 black SUVs, a weathered command jeep, and a bus full of war-toughened veterans were already on their way, coming not with banners or speeches, but with presence, with memory, with weight. This is the story of how one girl's truth refused to be erased, and how an entire town was forced to remember what honor truly means. My name is Thomas Carter. I've been a security guard at Ridgeview Middle School for 7 years. Quiet job, quiet town. I'm a veteran myself, though I retired over 3 decades ago. But you don't really retire from some memories. They just sleep lightly. That morning the wind was sharp and carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. One of those autumn days that hums with something unspoken, as if the earth knows something important is about to happen. I stood at the front gate, jacket zipped, eyes on the students filing in beneath a low gray sky. Then I saw her, Emma Parker. She didn't just walk. She moved like she had somewhere to be, something to prove. Small shoulders squared, her hands clutched a worn folder, like it held a secret the world wasn't ready for. Around her neck, a silver pendant glinted as she passed, through a ray of morning light. I knew that insignia. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a badge of sacrifice, her father's, a staff sergeant, a man I'd never met but one I already respected. Emma wasn't just carrying a speech, she was carrying his memory. She paused at the office door, took a breath, then stepped inside. The door closed behind her with a soft click. I didn't need to hear what was said. I'd seen this scene before. She was asking to speak at the Veterans Day assembly. At Ridgeview, Veterans Day was about tradition, grandparents who served, safe applause, vague mentions of sacrifice wrapped in polished words. But Emma wasn't offering history. She was offering heart, raw, real, personal, and that's what scared them. When she came out, her face was pale, but her jaw was set with steel. Her eyes didn't meet mine, but I knew. She'd been told no. I waited a beat and stepped closer to the office door. Inside, I caught Principal Huxley's voice on the tail end of a phone call. "We just want to keep it general this year," she was saying. "Too personal can be unsettling for the younger kids." I bit down hard on the bitterness rising in my throat. They wanted flags, not faces. Songs, not names. Celebration, not sacrifice. That afternoon I saw her again, sitting alone on a bench near the edge of the playground, that pendant catching the golden light like a beacon. She opened her folder and began reading her speech. Not to an audience, just to the wind, just to herself. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the tremble in her fingers. I saw her lips move, steady and sure. She wasn't giving up. The next morning she tried again. She entered the office, eyes clear, voice quiet, hope still alive. But hope was met with bureaucracy. As she walked past me in the hallway, her nod was small but sharp. A message sent and received. She wasn't finished, and neither was I, because I knew that look, that ache, that anger. I had stood in enough back rooms, sat at enough folded flag funerals to know what it meant to be invisible in a place that promised to see you, and I knew Emma wouldn't let her father's memory be boxed away with all the other safe, tidy stories. That afternoon, after the last bell rang and the building exhaled its usual chaos, I saw her slip out the side door. Her steps were quick, head down, pendant clenched in her fist, like a lifeline. I followed. Not too close, just enough to be there. She crossed the field, boots brushing through brittle leaves until she reached the cemetery beyond the fence. No hesitation, no fear. She found his grave, knelt in the cold grass, opened the folder, and read. Her voice floated across the field like smoke, soft, steady, every word laid down with reverence, like bricks forming a home only she could see. I stood at a distance, watching as Emma Parker read aloud to a simple headstone that bore her father's, Tame Staff Sergeant Daniel Parker, father soldier hero. The wind moved her hair gently across her face, but she didn't flinch. Her hands trembled once. Her voice cracked only for a second. But she didn't stop. Because this wasn't just a speech. It was a promise, and she had come to keep it. She spoke every line like it mattered more than breath, her eyes fixed on the words, not on the world that had turned its back. Her father's name echoed in the cool air, unpolished and sacred. I watched as her shoulders shook, once sharply and then steadied again. She gripped the pendant tighter. She didn't let herself cry. She finished every sentence, every memory, every sacrifice. And when she had no more words to give, she folded the pages gently and held them to her chest. I saw her lips move in what might have been a prayer, or maybe a vow. One only she and the sky would ever hear. Then she rose, wiped the grass from her jeans and walked away. She didn't look back. Only when she disappeared over the hill did I step closer to the grave. I read the name on the stone, and for a moment, I felt like I'd known him too. Not through war stories or old photographs, but through her voice, through her fight. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the house around me quiet with that kind of silence that creeps into your bones. My old phone sat nearby, dusty, numbers faded from time and use. I stared at it, and then I dialed a number I hadn't called in nearly 10 years. It rang twice. Then a voice answered. Gruff, familiar, steady. The kind of voice only time and war can carve. I need a favor, I said. Then I told him about Emma. About the speech, about how she had been turned away while carrying the kind of truth that should never be silenced. He listened without interruption, and when I was done, he said 3 words that straightened my spine. We'll be there. That was all I needed, to hear. The next day passed with a surface calm. The students buzzed through classes, teachers carried on unaware. But beneath it all, something had shifted. I could feel it in the floorboards, in the space between footfalls. The air had changed. By late afternoon, I took my post near the front gate, like always, newspaper in hand but unread. My eyes scanned the horizon, waiting. Just after dusk, they began to arrive. First, a single black SUV. Its engine whispered low, headlights cutting through the growing dark. Then another, and another. 6 in total, all black, all silent. Then came the command jeep, paint faded by time, but standing proud. And behind it, a plain white bus, the kind used to carry ghosts, the kind filled with men and women who had carried things the world would never understand. They didn't blast horns, they didn't get out, they just waited. Their silence said more than words ever could. Teachers peeked through blinds, whispers stirred like wind through dry leaves. The principal's face paled as she counted the vehicles lining the curb. Inside, students pressed their faces to glass, unsure whether they should be excited or afraid. One boy asked, "Who are they?" His friend replied, barely above a whisper, "I don't know, but I think they're here for someone." I stepped down the front stairs, boots crunching against frosted grass. I knew every man and woman in those vehicles. Some I'd served with, some I only knew by the scars they carried, and the silence in their eyes. One stepped out, tall, silver-haired, a row of medals glinting faintly on his jacket. He didn't speak, just looked at me with a nod that carried more weight than any salute. Doors opened one by one, men and women in dress blues, others in jackets long faded, patched with years of war and survival. Some leaned on canes, some moved. Stiffly from injuries the world no longer noticed, but every single one stood tall side by side, a wall of memory, a line of promise. Inside the school, panic stirred in small ways. Teachers spoke in hushed tones. The principal stepped out, tried to summon a smile, tried to smooth the fear from her face. She began to speak. Something about visitors, something about safety. But no one answered, because the veterans didn't come for conversation. They came for Emma. They came for the words she wasn't allowed to speak, and they weren't going to leave until she said them. Morning came like the opening of a wound, slow, raw, impossible to ignore. The auditorium filled the way it always did on Veterans Day. Teachers herded students into rows, adjusting microphones, arranging papers, pretending the day was like any other, but it wasn't. Not today, because outside the veterans stood like sentinels, still silent, their uniforms stiff in the cold air, their eyes fixed forward. They weren't here for ceremony. They were here for truth. Inside you could feel it, the tension beneath the surface. Kids whispered, shifting in their seats, sensing something unscripted was about to unfold. Even the teachers seemed unsure, their voices low, their smiles brittle. Emma sat in the third row, her small hands wrapped around the silver pendant at her neck. Her speech was folded tightly in her lap. She didn't fidget, didn't smile. She waited, the kind of waiting that's more like bracing, for impact, for consequence, for the moment when the choice must be made. Principal Huxley took the stage. Poised, practiced. Her words rose into the room like perfume, pretty but empty. She spoke of sacrifice, of tradition, of honor, but never once did she look toward the veterans who lined the walls in silence. When the final student speaker finished, their tribute generic and safe, Principal Huxley returned to the podium. Flipping to the last page of her notes, she didn't hesitate. "There will be no additional speakers today," she said, her voice smooth and final. The words rang through the auditorium like a gavel, and for a moment, the room stood frozen. Until Emma stood. She didn't ask for permission, she simply rose. Her breath caught once, her knees almost gave, just for a second. But then she lifted her chin, her fingers wrapped around the folded speech like a lifeline. "I have something to say," she said. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Her words cut through the silence like a match to dry grass. "Principal." Huxley turned, her expression tightening. "I'm sorry, Emma," she said again, her voice edged with carefully measured finality. "Your piece wasn't approved. We're focusing on group recognition today." She motioned toward Emma's seat, already trying to move on. But Emma didn't move, she didn't even blink. She looked straight at the principal, and then past her, to the rows of veterans lining the room, to the men and women who had bled and lost and carried their burdens in silence, waiting for someone to speak for them. That's when it happened. A hand moved. Just one at first. A glove slipped off, then another, and another. One by one, the veterans removed their gloves and placed bare hands over their hearts. Chins lifted, eyes locked on Emma. Not a word was spoken, but it was louder than any protest. Emma took a breath and stepped forward. Her hands shook, but her voice, God, her voice, held steady. "My father taught me never to be silent when something matters," she said. The room stopped breathing. Principal Huxley opened her mouth, maybe to object again, maybe to remind Emma of policies and permissions, but she never got the chance, because one of the veterans stepped forward. Just one step. That was all it took. His boot echoed on the auditorium floor like thunder. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His presence silenced every rule in the building. Emma moved to the microphone. She unfolded the pages with trembling fingers, lifted her head and began to read. "Don't ever let them tell you to be silent about what matters most." Her voice cracked on the first line, but it didn't break. Not once. She told them who. Her father was what he gave, why she had to speak. And as she read, the veterans lifted their hands in salute, slow, unified, silent. It was reverence. It was defiance. It was a message to the world. We remember. The principal stood rigid beside the stage, but she couldn't stop it now. No one could. Even the children sat frozen, wide-eyed, silent, small hands resting in laps. Emma read every word like it was a final breath. Like her voice was carrying her father's name across time and silence, and the stubborn walls of polite tradition. And when she reached the last line, she looked up, eyes shining. "I spoke for him," she said simply, "because he can't." The veterans didn't clap, they didn't cheer. They simply held the salute a moment longer, and then lowered their hands in perfect unison, heads bowed, hearts heavy, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was sacred. Emma stepped down from the stage without fanfare, without applause. No one moved. No one dared. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Because in that silence, the entire auditorium understood. This was no longer Ridgeview Middle School's Veterans Day Assembly. This was Emma's moment. Principal Huxley stood stiff at the podium, her words lost somewhere between policy and shame. She didn't try to stop Emma again. She couldn't. The power in the room had shifted. It no longer belonged. To her, Emma returned to her seat slowly, deliberately, her shoulders steady. That silver pendant on her chest caught the light like a beacon, an anchor, a vow, a symbol of everything she carried and refused to bury. She sat, calm, composed. And then, without instruction, without announcement, the veterans began to move. From the shadowed side aisles, they stepped forward one by one, their boots whispering against the auditorium floor. Each held something small in their hands, not grand offerings but pieces of memory, personal, intimate. The first man placed a pair of dog tags at the foot of the stage. He didn't say a word, didn't linger, just a nod, then turned back. Next, a woman, her short grey hair sharp against her uniform, laid down a tattered shoulder patch, its edges worn thin by years of service. Another veteran followed, his hand shaking slightly as he placed a folded letter on the stage. Its paper yellowed, by time soft at the corners, a letter that had likely lived in the inner pocket of his coat longer than anyone knew. One after another they came, each laying down their own small offering, their own tribute. They didn't speak. They didn't need to, because each item whispered stories the world had long forgotten, stories of friendship, of sacrifice, of nights that never ended and prayers whispered under a blood-red sky. By the time the last veteran stepped back, the stage had become something else entirely. Not a platform, a shrine, a sacred place built from memory, guarded by silence, wrapped in the kind of respect you don't ask for, but earn. Emma didn't move. She didn't reach for the tokens. She understood. They weren't for her to keep. They were for her father, for what she had done, for the truth she had refused to let die. From the back of the room I watched it all unfold, my hands clenched, my throat tight. In 7 years of guarding these halls, I had seen 1,000 assemblies, 1,000 speeches, but none of them ever meant something the way this one did. Emma Parker had changed the room. She had changed us, and we all knew it. When the assembly ended, there was no announcement. No chime, no rehearsed thank you from the stage. The students rose quietly, drifting into the sunlight beyond the school doors, like leaves carried on a solemn wind. No laughter, no noise, just the soft shuffling of feet and the weight of something, sacred in their chests. The teachers moved slowly, as if stunned by the magnitude of what had passed. They didn't gather the items from the stage. No one dared touch them, not today, not after that. I waited until the last student left, then walked slowly toward the front of the auditorium. Emma was still there, gathering her papers, careful, focused. There was a peace about her now. Quiet, hard-earned, unshakable. Before I could say anything, one of the veterans stepped forward. He knelt beside her, his face weathered, a deep scar tracing his jaw like a signature left by a war the world forgot. He spoke low. "You did right by him," he said. "And today you made sure none of us would ever forget." Emma looked at him, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. She simply nodded, because some moments speak louder than gratitude. The man touched her shoulder gently, then rose and walked away. And still the tokens remained at the foot of the stage. Dog tags, patches, letters, pieces of soul. A circle of memory left untouched, each one a silent vow, each one a weight willingly given. As the veterans began to file out, I noticed something that stopped me cold. At the exit stood a small table with a framed photo of Staff Sergeant Daniel Parker, Emma's father. Just one picture, just one name. And as they passed it, each veteran paused, every single one. They laid a hand on the frame. Not long, just enough. Enough to say, "We see you." And then they walked out into the morning light. The auditorium emptied, but the room didn't feel vacant. It felt sacred, like it was still holding its breath. unwilling to disturb what had just happened. I stood alone now, surrounded by the tokens the veterans had left at the stage. Each one, a memory made tangible. They rested there like blessings no one dared move. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Outside, the autumn sun burned low and sharp, cold air sharpening the edges of the morning. I followed at a distance as Emma walked down the path away from the school. She didn't hurry, didn't slouch under the weight of what she'd done. She walked like someone who had fulfilled a promise, and in doing so, found a piece of herself she hadn't even known was missing. Her backpack hung from one shoulder. The silver pendant around her neck gleamed in the sunlight. She looked so small, and yet, I swear, she walked like a giant. At the edge of the school grounds stood a memorial wall. Old bricks, worn plaques, names carved by hand and time. Emma stopped there. She stood before her father's name, and under it, someone had left a single bouquet of white chrysanthemums. Tucked into the flowers was a card, the kind you might miss if you weren't looking closely, but Emma saw it. She leaned forward, fingers brushing the petals. Then she read the card. It was written in bold, blocky handwriting. We remember him as we remember our own. She stood there for a long time, silent, still. Then, just barely, she smiled. Small, quiet, but real. I stayed hidden behind the hedges, giving her the moment. She had earned it. She hadn't demanded applause. She hadn't begged for permission. She hadn't yelled, accused, or blamed. She had stood up. She had spoken the truth, and she had trusted that it would be enough. And it was, because some names deserve more than a plaque. They deserve to be carried forward in voices, in memories, in the eyes of a child who refuses to forget. I thought of my own time in uniform, of the names I'd tucked away like dog tags in a drawer, each one a friend, a brother, a shadow that still walked beside me. And now there was Emma, seventh-grade girl who stood in front of an auditorium and refused to sit down. She'd given us all something we hadn't even realized we'd lost: the courage to remember. Not with banners, not with songs, but with silence that demanded to be heard. When she finally turned away from the memorial, I followed at a distance. She didn't know I was there. She didn't need to, because this wasn't about recognition. This was about legacy. I thought of the words she had spoken. I spoke for him. Because he can't. And I knew I would carry that with me for the rest of my life. That evening, long after the sun had dipped behind the trees and the halls of Ridgeview had gone quiet again, I walked back to the stage. The tokens were still. There no one had dared move them. I didn't touch them either. I just stood there, letting the memories settle around me like a slow breath. And in that moment, I understood something simple and profound. Some stories don't need applause. They just need to be told. The next morning, the auditorium sat empty, but the air still carried yesterday's weight like smoke that refused to clear. The stage hadn't been touched. The dog tags, the patch, the old letter. They were still there, untouched offerings, left by people who knew that some things shouldn't be cleaned up. I stood near the door, watching the early light stretch across the wood floor like a quiet benediction. Then I saw her, Emma. She entered alone. No fanfare, no audience, just quiet. Steps on polished tile. She moved slowly to the stage, eyes scanning the items left behind. She didn't reach for them, didn't try to claim them. She just looked, and I could see it. She knew. Those were gifts for her father, and for the voice that had spoken for him. Before I could speak, a veteran stepped forward from the side door. The same one with the silver, hair and medals that caught the light like whispers of old battles. He said nothing at first. Then gently he knelt beside her again. His voice was low and worn, like gravel softened by rain. "Your father was one of us," he said, "and because of you, none of us will ever forget him." Emma didn't cry. She didn't even blink. She just nodded, solemn, steady. She understood the weight of what she had done, not just for herself, but for every soldier who had been left out of the story, for every name that had faded from a wall. No one visited anymore. The man stood slowly, his knees cracked with age, but his posture was proud. As he turned to leave, The others began to follow. One by one, they approached a small framed photograph on a table by the auditorium door. Staff. Sergeant Daniel Parker in uniform, each veteran stopped, laid a hand on the frame, just for a second, just enough to say, "We see you." Then they slipped out into the cold morning air. I watched as Emma gathered her papers, careful and quiet. She didn't rush. She didn't linger. She was different, now stronger, not louder, just more certain. She walked out of the auditorium, her silver pendant bouncing softly against her chest. I followed again, at a respectful distance, as she made her way through the school grounds. At the far end where the sidewalk curved near the memorial wall, she stopped once more. There, beneath her father's name, still lay the bouquet of white chrysanthemums. The card was still pinned to it. We remember him as we remember our own. She touched the petals again, her fingers soft and still. Then she smiled, a quiet, unshakable smile, the kind that doesn't need to prove anything, the kind born of promises, kept. I didn't step out, I didn't speak. She deserved this moment alone. She had already done the hard part. She had reminded a whole town what remembrance really looks like. Not a banner, not a song, but the courage of one small voice refusing to be silenced. As she turned and walked away, I felt something settle in my chest, something I hadn't known I was still carrying. It was pride, not just for her, but for the kind of honor we rarely see anymore. The kind that stands up when everyone else sits down. I thought of the years I'd spent in uniform, the memories I'd packed away in silence, and I realized Emma Parker had given us something we could never repay. Not a speech, not a performance, a truth, simple, unshakable, powerful. That remembrance lives not in ceremonies, but in defiant acts of love. That a name spoken aloud is a life remembered. That silence can be broken. That sometimes the smallest voice in the room carries the loudest truth. As I walked back to my post, the morning sun warm on my shoulders, I stood a little taller, and I made a promise to every name I carried in my heart I will remember, because Emma had shown me how.